Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I want to first of all thank Bayan and University of Chicago Institute Initiative on Islam and Medicine for hosting this. I'm sort of affiliated with both organizations. I had a distinct honor of teaching the pastoral care, spiritual care course about 2 years ago here at Bayan, and I'm an adjunct faculty. I also work very closely with Dr. Asim Padella. I'm an advisor to the initiative, and I think the two institutions coming together and producing a conference like this is wonderful, and I'm excited about future possibilities and opportunities here, so thank you both. About 2 years ago, we set out to work on, we created a working group. This is under the auspices of Initiative on Islam and Medicine. This working group came together from across the country, and various questions were to be answered. And once my slide is up, I'll pose one of the questions that we brought up 2 years ago. It's been in progress since, and now culminating in these presentations and papers. Okay, no problem. I'll keep going then. The question we set out to answer was, what is soul, and how are its capacities manifested bodily? This is in the Islamic realm. So again, what is soul, and how are its capacities manifested bodily? So connecting the metaphysics, which is the idea of soul, to physiology, which is the body. Myself, Dr. Padella, Sheikh Jihad Brown, also known as Jason Brown, who's our philosopher exemplar on this paper, have been studying, and along with the rest of the group, we kind of, I think, opened a Pandora box of complexities and conflicts for ourselves. Asim, I don't know if you would agree with that, but because in so studying the soul, it's particularly in relevance to my field, which is neurology, we had to study brain, and thus we had to study consciousness. So soul in our definitions, or in the representational schema, was the consciousness, where brain was the matter, the physiology. And there is a long history of what's taken place in this discussion. This goes back to not just 12th century Islamic theology and philosophy, but also from Descartes on in the Western European theoretical philosophy of mind discussions. It's been a very controversial but yet evolving field. So I'd like to go into that, summarize some of these items that I think will then be reflected in our paper. So I was passing by one of the corridors at my hospital. I'm at St. Jude's Hospital, one of the hospitals I work in, and one of the staff members there puts on a quote every week, and I didn't know this quote ever before, but I figured there's never, you can never start a scientific presentation or a topic without quoting a fiction writer. So, and I think this caught my attention because this was perfectly relevant when C.S. Lewis said, "You don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body." So if you believe that a lot of the scientific advancement comes from the fiction writers, you must be a Star Trek fan, and therefore maybe a C.S. Lewis fan. In the outline of our paper, we wanted to talk about both the neuroscience of consciousness, philosophy of mind, and the discussion on soul, which will be specific to Islamic theology. So in framing the discourse, here's what we came up. Here's what we came up and around. Over the last, at least in the scientific community, most of our thinking in terms of brain and soul is what we term as the reductionist materialist argument. What that means is that all that you are is, all that the brain is matter. It's nothing but neural electrical impulses. So rabbis' whole dichotomy, a whole schemata of the path of soul, the pathway of soul that you presented, the scientific community would, in a large part, would really take an issue with that. Because to the scientific community, the soul is really it's nothing but matter. Matter, which is physical. This has been the mainstay of how, maybe we don't even realize there are many physicians and healthcare professionals in the field. This is how we are trained. And this reflects in our clinical work as well. The next slide. So in terms of how the theologians or theophilosophy folks understood this, and they had, essentially there was a counter narrative to this. And this is more recent and in the past. Sayyid Hossein Nasr, for example, said the profound reality of our consciousness cannot be eradicated by the accident of bodily death. What that really means is that consciousness, in this case, is referring to soul essentially. That just material death alone does not necessarily mean that you as a human self, you as a self or nafs is done. There's a continuity of soul. There's some continuity of you. In the Islamic realm, in the Islamic discussion, the most formative work in this field was done in 12th to 14th centuries. That tends to be in most fields. If you're an Islamic historian or Islamic law person, a lot of what we derive from is really from those formative years. The more in the terms of 14th to 16th century is generally thought that that was the era that some of that information from earlier generations were more canonized. More authenticated, more work was written, but was all based on earlier work. Then later, after the 16th century, we really see sort of less and less literature, especially on the issue of philosophy of mind, on discussion on the issues of soul. We see a decline in it, and my colleague Jihad Brown boldly claims in the last 100 years hardly any work has been done on it. But similarly, we see some similar pattern. We see that the discussion of philosophy of minds, beginning with Descartes, begins in the 17th century, picks up with some intensity at that time, continues for the next couple of hundred years, but also dies off in the Western discussions on philosophy of mind. Then in the last 30 years, at least in neuroscience, and scientists have picked this discussion up. So we're seeing the number of articles that are being published are a lot more. So the discussion is intensified, and we're placing our conversation right in the middle of that discussion vis-a-vis brain and the soul. I'll put a Quranic verse in terms of when we talk about soul. This is often the starting point. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Meaning, and they ask you, O Muhammad, about the soul. Say, the soul is of the affair of my Lord, and mankind has not been given knowledge of except a little. And the term here uses a ruh. A ruh technically is also translated as spirit, something that's more of a spiritual realm. But Quran also uses the word nafs repeatedly. That's considered more an appropriate term for the definition of soul. And the rational soul that represents humans is called nafs al-natiqa for those that might be interested. The next slide really summarizes very nicely the distinction between mind over matter, or mind versus matter. This author says that thoughts, sensations, feelings, and intentions do not have mass, momentum, shape, spatial location, spatial extension, or temporal location, and they are neither particles nor waves. Meanwhile, material objects do possess some spatial temporal properties. Since conscious states lack the properties of material objects, it follows that consciousness is neither identical with nor reducible to matter. This summarizes really essentially what we have been exploring, and that's the idea that the matter alone does not encapsulate all of your mind. I actually do this not out of amusement, but more out of curiosity. I have large number of traumatic brain injury patients, so I pose a question to them in my clinic often. I ask them, because they have cognitive challenges, but those who can understand, I said, do you think all of your mind is in your brain? And it just always amazes me the reaction that I get, this both puzzlement, but also eyes pop open, and there's sort of I think they get sort of stimulated by the question itself. And there's no study on it, Austin. This is just anecdote, so don't hold me to it. But this I find very interesting because I think people in general call us egotistic. Neil deGrasse Tyson will have an issue with that, but we are just not willing to let go of our primacy and position in the universe, if you will. Next slide. Actually, I'm going to skip the next quote, but I want to talk about the neuroscience of consciousness. And what is consciousness? Consciousness, I put two definitions of consciousness. One is a little bit older and the other is newer. And the only reason I put these two definitions is to contrast one point. Dr. William James in the 1890s defined consciousness as an active process involving awareness of oneself. which is basically the crux of it, and the environment. And later now, as we describe it now, we create a localization to it. We extend the definition to say that it is wakefulness, but it's served by a particular location in the brainstem. So now our advanced knowledge has allowed us to specify locations within the brain and the functions that they have. Next slide. I use that as a punitive slide when I give it to my medical students to memorize. You don't need to memorize it, but this illustrates the point that we have come to the point where we have subcomponents of consciousness that we can actually locate in these different various brain regions. And I'll tell you why that's going to be problematic in a second. It's going to be problematic actually because this begs a question about unity of consciousness. It's a philosophical term. The unity of consciousness, something that theoretical philosophy was struggling with, but then when neuroscience came to this degree of sophistication, I think neuroscience is struggling with that as well. And I will tell you that of all the material available to us, I don't think that neuroscience has any very well-defined explanation for unity of consciousness. Moving on, consciousness system, we look at consciousness system at two levels. One is its content, and the other is its level. So content are those emotions, experiences. David Chalmers described them as qualia. These subjective feeling. Like for example, you can have a cup of coffee, reading a newspaper. Maybe you're watching a TV at this baseball game at the same time. I mean, it's a culmination of stimuli that you're enjoying and experiencing. That involves contents, different processing at different levels, but it's a content. The level of consciousness is that, God forbid, you could be in a coma. Meaning it's a level, it's the medical awareness, it's a medical state of the brain. So it comes, we look into that, and at next slide I'll show you that the level of consciousness is actually quite widespread. It's not, you can't just define it by one region. Each region has a role, but the full comprehensive conscious experience, we call it phenomenal consciousness, is very widespread. It has to have interconnectivity throughout all of the brain. That may be one way we will achieve the unity of conscious experience, although it is not fully defined in scientific and neuroscientific terms. Next few slides I just talk about as a demonstration and it's an illustration about what happens if one of the components of elements of consciousness is affected. If, for example, alertness, which is the key, if you're not alert, you can't do anything. It means you have really no disposition to anything in your environment. If there's no alertness, in the absence of complete alertness, a patient is undoubtedly in a comatose state. So alertness, in the next slide, alertness comes from a very specific area of the brainstem. We know a lot about it. In the initial slide, I even mentioned the neurotransmitters or chemicals that modulate this effect. But this particular area of the brain, if this is highly damaged, one could very well be in a comatose state. That modulates alertness. Another aspect of consciousness is awareness. This is also critical because if you are not aware, and awareness is very widely distributed in the brain, but if you're not aware, then you may be in a state called persistent vegetative state. You could have been a little bit alert, slightly alert, but if you're not aware or unable to interact with the environment, it's a state in neurology called the persistent vegetative state. So keep that definition in mind, and then the third aspect of it would be attention. If attention is lacking, if attention is lacking in a very, very significant way, one could be considered to be in the minimally conscious state. In the next slide, this is a schemata that identifies sort of the damage in different brain areas at each one of these states. Brain death is complete graying out of the top portion of the brain. It's complete brain failure. Comatose state is large scale in the blue color, large scale damage to the brain, the forebrain, and also to the brainstem. Persistent vegetative state spares the brainstem, but involves a very extremely wide area of overall brain. So these are some physiological correlates of how we look at consciousness. To distinguish this as levels of consciousness from contents of consciousness. Content is the experiential aspect, would be the emotions, spirituality, pain, memory, cognition. Those are contents of consciousness. We also will keep referring to them as phenomenal consciousness. This is going to be more of the crux of our discussion in terms of soul. In assessing that, the next slide actually, where it says assessing consciousness, We think the actual loss of consciousness due to various causes is typically accompanied by a breakdown of brain's capacity to integrate neuronal activity across distant areas, especially via top-down or reentrant connectivity, supported by integrity of frontoparietal areas. Typically, high conscious levels are associated with an increased range of conscious contents. Whether or not high level of consciousness without any conscious contents is possible remains unclear. The two take-home points from this particular author and article, one is that we have enough understanding of the location of conscious contents. We call it prefrontal cortex. And we also understand the physiology of it. There is a 40 to 70 hertz range of activity within the brain that stimulates that level of content of consciousness. Now, in Islamic theology, we understand that animals do not have rational soul. Rational soul is called nafs al-natiqa. Animals do not have rational soul. There's also some correlation when there's some discussion that you'll see that, except for high primates, you'll see that the lower primates have less and less of prefrontal cortex phylogenetically. So this is some correlation in terms of the contents of how they may process even pain, such as pain being an emotion. It's processed differently in animals. So moving on, subconscious to conscious. Consciousness thus depends on the multitude of unconscious processes that occurs in the brain. Although they don't represent consciousness, consciousness cannot exist without these processes. The factor that determines which of the subconscious processes will reach consciousness appears to be focused attention. This act of deliberately bestowing attention on something specific draws attention to the enigma of free will. The reason I think this is important, because this is relevant to the idea of soul, is that we have the first quote, the slide before that said we can have unconscious processes and subconscious processes that can be very sophisticated, and they could be taking place in the brain without us being aware of it. And we have identified how that process works physiologically. Yet, unless there's sustained focused attention that is deliberately produced by us, we don't absorb those stimuli. In neuroscience, David Chalmers and others do beg the question, therefore, is that where is that sustained attention coming from? Is that an act of free will? Free will being more of a theological concept than a neurological concept. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in the discussion of the soul a little bit. And then next slide is just a schemata. If you guys ever have access to these slides, it's a good schemata of how consciousness is depressed at various levels, from coma to vegetative state to even anesthesia and sleep. That there's different varying levels of consciousness that vary depending on the state of the brain. That is very well correlated with the state of the brain. It's something that's very useful. But in terms of going back, because I'm going back between levels of consciousness and contents of consciousness, hoping to focus on the content of consciousness, which is phenomenal consciousness. In my next slide, I want to talk about cognition. Cognition is an important element of the content of consciousness. Cognition, we understand in 5 of its main categories. In the next slide, those 5 categories are listed. It's language, memory, executive function, visual spatial function, and emotion. Language, for example, is the domain of the left brain. Visual spatial is the domain of the right brain. Executive function is the domain of the frontal lobes, and memory is the domain, it's widely spread, but temporal lobes. Emotion is also widely spread. So what does it mean? Why is cognition important? Take the example of somebody who may have dementia. Take the example of somebody who has advanced dementia. If you have advanced dementia, you're possibly unable to process emotions, not like somebody who would be cognitively intact, of course. You may have pain as an emotion. Could you experience spirituality? We don't know. And advanced dementia patients can become nonverbal. They can become bedbound. I mean, they're terminal patients. Yet, there's nobody in this room that would deny that, it's a matter of faith that they do still have soul. So for the materialist and reductionist argument, to say, well, there is no such thing as soul, it's all brain, and when brain is highly damaged as such, it creates a particular problem which we call a binding problem. We'll go into that in a little bit. In assessing cognition, in the next slide, there's increasing evidence that in healthy awake humans, many, if not all, cognitive functions that involve frontal-parietal areas, because the frontal-parietal areas are the key areas for contents of consciousness, can also operate in the absence of reportable conscious perception of the relevant stimuli, even if performance is usually much diminished, as in this dementia patients. There will be some complex cognitive processing going on in these patients. One example of that is in sleep states and even awake states, you actually have more metabolism in the visual cortex, because we're stimulated more by vision. Visual processing is key. Then in the frontal areas being defined by neuroscience as the key area for the contents of consciousness. But this argument, this particular paper here really questions that whole debate, it really questions that. Again, creating what we call a binding problem. We in neuroscience are trying to understand is that where these different areas of the brain are processing different levels of information, some more than the other, some we thought were more than the other, and that was counterintuitive, as in this visual cortex. How is it binded together to produce a unified, pleasant or unpleasant experience, like an emotion? How is that done? We don't have a good neuroscientific theory, and I think the binding problem still persists for neuroscience, just as it persists for theoretical philosophy to explain. In the next slide, I'll give you a quick example of memory. If we see patients that have amnesia, even those patients with amnesia, if they have learned to drive, if they've been driving all their lives, they would be able to drive. The habit and the skills, what we call implicit memories, they do not dissipate. So in other words, some of the stored information, the skill set, remains with these patients, even amnestic patients. Therefore, begging the questions that the complex, because memory is a complex process, complex contents of consciousness could continue to function where other higher cognitive processes are diminished. Again, raising one important point that is really could we reduce mind to just the matter, which is brain? Could you just reduce our entire constitution to a physiological matter, which is the brain? And that is a constant theme in all these discussions. Spirituality, in the next slide, spirituality is another function which is a very complex concept, a complex emotion. It's a high level, high caliber content of consciousness. I'll skip the next slide on spirituality. I'll go to the following one that says volition. Volition are acts of will. Free will can be, there's enough folks here that have an interest in theology and theological philosophy that would be more than willing to discuss with us the idea of free will or predestination. But what do neuroscience think of it? Zhu and his colleagues in this paper really very brilliantly demonstrated that volition or acts of free will come from a very specific area of the brain, and that again is an anterior. It's in the prefrontal cortex, in a specific area of prefrontal cortex called anterior cingulate cortex. So now that we know where free will comes from, are we again willing to reduce that metaphysical question, the act of free wills, to a simple matter of physiology, that is just nothing but an electrical impulse within our brain? And I think neuroscience does not have, even knowing what we know about the location where some of this what I call free will but sustained attention comes from, we do not yet have a comprehensive neuroscientific theory on that. In the next few slides, which I'll just briefly mention a couple of items, arguments in the philosophy of mind, we delved into. This was mostly in context of Western philosophy of mind, beginning from Descartes. But what we see is that, what we focus on is that from most materialistic arguments, which are the reductionist arguments, to the least, and there's some definitions here that for those who want to reference it later, but I'll just mention one or two. Functionalism, in the next slide, for example, is an argument that denies that mind is anything more than the brain. It is a mere byproduct of the brain's physical activity. That's functionalism. It means no mind, all matter. So there's no mental, only physiological. Another, next one is epiphenomenalism. Another sort of a materialistic argument, but it acknowledges that mind holds, but it cannot have any effect on the physical world. It's actually not a materialistic argument, it's a physicalist argument. There's one that says agnostic physicalism, if you can go down to that one. Agnostic physicalism suggests that mind derives exclusively from matter of the brain, but this may not be the whole story. In other words, there may be non-material forces acting on the mind, but it's agnostic, just like you may be agnostic and you're not really unsure about the existence of God. This is agnostic argument about being unsure about the existence of mind over matter. And then there is a slide on dualistic interactionism. It's another argument in the philosophy of mind that holds that consciousness and other aspects of mind can occur independently of the brain. Lastly, I'll mention in the Islamic conceptions of soul, if you can put up Imam Ghazali's Gemara, we'll just briefly run over that before I end. If you can't see that, I mean, Imam Ghazali defined different elements of soul. You have the animal, you have the vegetative soul that has the potential for growth. You have the animalistic soul, that's our basic functions, appetite and so on and so forth. But then you have human and rational soul, which is nafs al-natiqa. This soul has the higher mental capacity, it has deliberative process, it has the element of free will. There are these components of soul. So soul, in other words, is a very comprehensive entity. It entails all of this. The rational or brain is a component of that. And the next slides we'll mention, and this is borrowed from my colleague Jihad Brown, who's written extensively, and we don't have a lot of material on the philosophy, on the Islamic conception of soul in writing in English language. He's one of the resources that have been valuable to us. He's done much valuable work in this field. And in this one, I want to mention two. Just looking at the list in the last 1,000 years, how Muslim philosophers and theologians have really dabbled and delved into different conceptions of the soul. And there's last two that I just want to mention as examples to give us a sense that this has been quite an elaborate debate. One is a very highly respected position amongst Muslim theologians called the subtle body position, also Jism al-Latif. It's a tenuously fine and atomically dispersed body, and it's the subtle body that's integrated into dense body, which is our physiology, which is corporeal body. So it means soul within a material world. It's accessible to 5 empirical sources. We think that this has been popular because it's been easier to explain as a concept, but it runs into various problems, particularly binding problems and other problems, philosophical issues. A more amenable concept that I think has caught on is the immaterial substance idea, which is the next slide, called al-Juhur al-Mujarrad, which is a non-physical entity sort of dispersed throughout. It's an immaterial entity. It doesn't have extensions, as the term used in philosophy. It's independent, indivisible, non-spatial. The soul, therefore, is a substratum that supports the faculties inhering in their singular and unified substrate, which is the body. And for those who may be interested, and I triple check, this has a dualistic component. But then a lot of the neuroscience, here's the thing about Cartesian dualism, a lot of the neuroscience, a lot of the scientific philosophy in the last few years has really focused on arguments against Christian dualism. At least that's how we feel. I mean, this has been a crux of what science has done. But there are other forms of dualism aside from Cartesian dualism that warrant some attention, and that's what our philosophers have done here. Even though this immaterial substance has a sense of dualism, it doesn't. I don't think. So this is the onus on the Muslim theological experts and expert community, if they want to distinct their conceptions away from dualism altogether, they have a lot more work to do. So the point I'm making here is that we can criticize neuroscience and the scientific community for its lapses in knowledge, in defining the unity of consciousness, and not being able to, even despite knowing as much as we know, and adequately answering the questions of binding problem. But I think philosophy of mind in Western context and discourse in Islamic theology of soul also runs in quite a bit of philosophical and theological conundrums. And we have the opportunity in our paper to really contrast and compare some of these controversies, and that we hope it adds to the conversation that is just a growing field, as Asim said. This is all sort of newer contributions in the English language by many of us. So we appreciate your attention and this conference. Thank you.